I recently went on a little trip to Japan with the humble goal of collecting panties so frothy you could open your own bakery. I ended up settling on a PlayStation Vita. It wasn't something I was initially set on, as I knew the library was considered quite weak even for a JRPG fan, and all the NEP games are already on PC. Except for this one. The idea of having a decently beefy handheld romanced me, and I got a lot out of owning a PSP, so I figured this would be more or less the same, only with analog sticks that don't cause long-term hand mongulation. Stray YouTube videos also played a mongulated hand in this, where people would proclaim that the Vita's a worthwhile system in current year. Well, I disagree. The portability is obviously the biggest draw to a handheld, so plenty of small issues can be overlooked in exchange for playing Dragon's Crown on the toilet, or while you drive. One of the Vita's biggest problems, however, is that a lot of games are underdeveloped and have a bunch of technical issues as a result. Some of the worst offenders happen to be ports. It's a shame too, because moving old games to new systems seems to be the in thing right now, what with Steam becoming a dumping ground for every game ever made, and the Switch selling like hotcakes that suck your dick. A large criticism during the early years of the PSP was that it was little more than a port machine. A portable, if you will. But it ended up having one of the strongest handheld libraries to date, especially if you're a fan of JRPGs, and this was bolstered by a bunch of old games that ran pretty well. I wish I could say the same for the Vita. Whether it's an indie title which has performance issues, or a AAA game which has performance issues, no amount of portability can make up for software that simply doesn't run properly, but this may not be the console's fault. I read an interesting post-mortem written by one of the people who ported Bastion to the doomed Sony handheld, and it was an incredibly interesting read, even if a lot of it went straight over my head. It lightly details some of the processes enacted to get the Vita version up to scratch and running decently well. Even though their efforts were clearly thorough, Bastion still has frame drops in action-heavy areas, which makes me think if this much work went into it and it still doesn't run properly, maybe the issue is the console and not just incompetent developers. Oh look, it crashed. It's likely that the low user base led to less resources for ports, which led to shittier ports, which means that fewer consoles are sold because there's a shortage on good games that run well. You get the point. It's entirely plausible that it was a victim of cyclical destruction, and a lot of games got the poopy end of the stick. Also detailed in the Bastion post was a couple specific mentions of heavy memory constraints, so I'm not making definitive statements about what the Vita can and can't do, just that some games may have turned out better with a bit more fine-tuning. If you mod the bastard and force titles to run at the maximum clock rate, some performance issues vanish at the cost of your battery life, and even if it only gains a couple frames, those frames are very much appreciated. But then there's games like Jak and Daxter, XCOM, Borderlands 2, shit, even the Vita exclusive Uncharted, games which had significant hardware moving potential in their day, but could barely move themselves on the modest system. Fuck man, portable XCOM. Like that's what's gonna tip me over the edge to buying a Switch. Put XCOM 2 on that shit with mod support, I'd never get anything done. That's not to say they're all bad. Some standout exceptions are Ratchet & Clank 3, Muramasa, Dragon's Crown, that's shit, anything made by Vanillaware, Sly 2, The Binding of Isaac, just to name a few, and all the games I mentioned run pretty much flawlessly. It's just a shame that games of their quality weren't more commonplace, as I've played a fair chunk of the library and performance is mixed across the board. So if you haven't done much research on the Vita, you might be wondering what makes up the core library. Well, I hope you like reading, because there's a shit ton of visual novels. And JRPGs, which would make me a very happy boy if they didn't all have superior versions of pretty much every game on either the PC or the PS4. 9 out of 10 times I'd look up a particular Vita RPG only to find that it's either wormed its way onto Steam or GOG or headed console bound to the PS4. When games drop on PC, every other platform becomes irrelevant for me because I know that if they don't run correctly, there are things I can do to mitigate it. Most of the time. Whatever hand you're dealt on console is the one you go all in on, and you're at the whim of a developer who may or may not patch it. But even then, games like Dragon Quest Builders and Gravity Rush run infinitely better on PS4 than they do on Vita. Sure, you lose the portable element, but you're also playing a technically superior version, so I'd say it's a worthy trade-off. It's also disgusting how many Vita titles have huge, glaring technical issues that never got addressed. Maybe I've just been spoiled by other handheld systems, like I've always defended the 3DS because of the great RPG selection and the fact that most games can at least maintain a bare minimum frame rate. Whenever I start a new game on the Vita, I never know what the fuck I'm in for. Akiba's Trip ran at a frame rate comparable to the anime it thinks it is, Borderlands 2 isn't a good game anyway, but it's even worse at 15 frames per second. Digimon World Next Order has huge frame dips and screen tearing. Fucking screen tearing on a console game. Dragon Quest Heroes 2 shits the bed because Musou games don't belong on handhelds. God of War 1 and 2 have the PS2 cutscenes that haven't been resized for Vita and they look like shit. Jak and Daxter stuttered like it starred in Back to the Future. Killzone Mercenary, a big game designed specifically for the system, also features big frame dips. Papers, Please doesn't have enough screen real estate, so you gotta do this juggling act between the upper and lower sections of the screen. Adds unnecessary extra shit, micromanagement, fuck! One Piece World Red, The Amazing Spider-Man, Sonic Transformed, Uncharted The Golden Abyss, all desperately struggle to stay near 30 frames a second, and it's very noticeable. This isn't even a definitive list, this isn't even a quarter of the games I played. I could keep going, but the video's gotta end at some point. And I'm not saying all these are deal breakers, they're just great examples of how the Vita's a grab bag of quality. The few games that remain platform exclusive as of this video aren't really worth owning an entire system for. Despite the fact that there have been some fantastic titles, if you're not a fan of Persona 4 or the Atelier series, there's not a lot the system can offer you. Ah, fuck, there goes another one. Maybe I've just missed all the good games, but it also seems like the Vita library lacks the creative risks taken by its predecessor, the PSP. Games like Loco Roco, Patapon, Crisis Core, Grand Knight's History, Dissidia, The Third Birthday, not that one, a Katamari game that's not shit, all worked within the constraints of the system to make some unforgettable experiences, and that's just to name a few. These were all games that not only sold me on the idea of a handheld, but sold me on the idea of a creative platform. And look, if your head's not planted so far up your ass you can see the back of your teeth, that statement was probably the most pretentious, fart-sniffy thing you'll hear today. But that's genuinely how I feel about the PSP. I fucking love that system, even though it's designed for crab people. Two of the primary gimmicks for the Vita are the gyro sensors and the touchscreen input. Gyro is an iffy addition to any device, since rotating the console also rotates the screen. You're trying to line up a platform in Gravity Rush, and all of a sudden you're holding the cunt of a thing on a 60-degree angle at the expense of your wrists. How do you keep a consistent view of the screen when the console has to be rotated? It's usually offset with the manual controls, which means that games can't wholly rely on it, and it generally ends up being more of a nuisance than providing a worthwhile game experience. If your system's missing a second analog stick, it can be a passable stand-in for making small corrections, like how Ocarina of Time 3D assists aiming. But at best it's useless, and at worst it's detrimental to the core experience. The viewing angle on the 1000 model Vita is extremely generous though, so even if you're holding the console at an almost 90-degree angle, you can still vaguely make out what's on the screen. Even though I loathe gyro controls, I gotta give credit where credit's due and say that they compensated for such a feature with a fantastic screen. I can't really talk about the 2000 Vita because I don't have one, sorry. Then you've got your touchscreen controls, and the fundamental idea of a touchscreen is to mash the viewing area with your greasy Cheeto fingers, obstructing your view and leaving smudges on technology you don't deserve. Physically, you're also required to move one of your hands to the center of the device and abandon one side of the face controls. Fundamentally undermining game controls is fine, but requiring me to do that level of exercise when playing a video game is bullshit. I'm not saying that Sony's little bastard has nothing to offer, it just has comparatively little, and what little it has seems to be shrinking by the day. The hardware's great, it's not made for tiny Japanese boy hands in most respects, the PSP and PS1 backwards compatibility are fantastic, and look stunning on the OLED screen if you're lucky enough to have one. Even the touchscreen's not that bad in the few games it's used. Like, it's suboptimal, but most games aren't pushy with it. The hardware isn't all perfect, however. There's the issue of the back touchpad, which sucks in games like God of War, where it's the interact button, or Borderlands 2, where it's the melee and run toggle. I was trying to do glitches in Jak 2, and every time I'd relax my fingers on the back of the console, it'd switch to a first-person view mode, or change the height of vehicles. There were also plenty of times it failed to pick up an input, and it seemed like I could never consistently nail how to interact with the cunt of a thing to get the desired output. Most games just flat out avoided using it, or had an option to disable it, and I think that was probably for the best. Sure, it can add functionality, and Tearaway used it in a creative way, where it did the thing with the fingers, but I ain't into that. Now if it were toes. The sticks are also too close to the face buttons, and simply resting my thumb on the D-pad pushes the analog stick in a downward direction. If you want to not arc your thumbs over the sticks, you need to flare out your hands and hold the bastard like a fucking accordion. Outside of that, it's very comfortable to hold. I just don't think it's an ideal system for action games due to the narrow stick slapping. And I don't want you to take this video as me shitting on the Vita. I don't want to shit on the Vita. You don't buy a game system and then take out a second mortgage to buy a fucking memory card so you can hate the thing. I wanted to love it. It just fought me every step of the way. And I hope this video is a valuable information dump for people who might be looking at buying one. I'm not trying to dissuade you, and I'm not saying you're wrong for liking it. I just think it's important to have all the information. Information I wish I had before I purchased a system that has relatively little to offer. YouTube hype men will scream about how great an investment it is, but are usually vague so as to tiptoe around the heavy faults, and some even allude to it running PS3 equivalent titles, which is a complete joke. Most multi-platform games were significantly downgraded for the system and barely run at an acceptable frame rate. I guess it kinda is like the PS3 in that regard. The future of the system's also looking bleaker than ever. Sony is stopping production of physical games outside of Japan as of this year, discontinuing hardware in Japan as of next year, and with the few remaining exclusives being on port watch, it's only a matter of time before life support is turned off completely. Unlike past consoles and handhelds, it will not leave a pretty corpse. Unless you got that OLED screen, that shit looks amazing.